Hello and welcome. I hope you can hear and see me. My name is Alex Katz. I'm a board member of March of the Living Australia. Cedric Geffen often hosts these, but he's temporarily unavailable. He'll be with us shortly. In the meantime, it's my great honor to welcome everyone to this online event with Eva Zeleznikow. The Wittenberg Affair, an example of choiceless choices. Eva will tell us what that means shortly. But in the meantime, it's my honor to firstly welcome everyone and acknowledge the traditional lands where we all gather. I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay respects to everyone, whatever lands they're on around Australia or around the world. Obviously, Eva's in Israel, and other people are joining us from other places too. So Eva is a graduate of RMIT University, where she did a Bachelor of Social Work with honors. That was in 2018 she finished. She has been a leader with Hineni Youth and Welfare and a leader of the Academy Onward program, where she led over 40 Australian youth in Israel for 6 weeks. Eva has deep family connections to the Holocaust. Some of you may remember her grandparents, who ran the Sherazad restaurant in Melbourne, and which has manifested in volunteering for numerous Jewish charity organizations of Holocaust Memorial, such as Remembering Our Past, where Eva facilitated opportunities for Holocaust survivors. Her strong personal connection to the Shoah most recently took her back to Israel, where she's currently pursuing an MA in Holocaust Studies at the University of Haifa and interning at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum on Kibbutz Lochmei HaGetaot. So without further ado, and you don't want to hear from me, let me pass it on to Eva, who will take us through the rest of the evening. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm just going to work out how to share my screen. So give me one moment. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see that. So it's all yours.
Excellent. Okay, so depending on where you are in the world, I wish to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Eva, and I'm going to present to you today a little bit about why I decided to come and study the Holocaust in Israel, and also discuss a bit what I'm researching here. I should warn you that this is one of the first times that I will be presenting in an academic forum. So I appreciate if you can bear with me. And if you have any questions, I'd appreciate if you could leave them till the end, and I'll try to the best of my abilities to answer your questions. So, one moment. So these are two images of two people that have had an incredible influence of my interest in studying the Holocaust. This is Masha and Avram. So they had great hardships in their lives, yet they managed to immigrate to Melbourne, Australia, and they created a unique restaurant which became a safe haven for so many. Avram was born in Vilna, Poland, and he was forced with his family to move into the Vilna Ghetto. His father had previously been taken away for being a Bundist, and he was imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and he was never heard from again. In the ghetto, Avram joined the resistance movement and managed to escape to the forest. His mother, his sister, brother-in-law, and baby nephew were taken to the Panari forest, where they were murdered by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squad. Avram escaped through over 50 kilometers of sewers, and he managed to survive in the Rudniki forest until being liberated. I remember him telling me that there were 3 groups of resistance fighters attempting to leave the forest from the ghetto. Avram was in charge of the second group. The first group were exiting through the tunnel, and the Germans were waiting for them. And Avram had the choice to either assist the first group, but risk the lives of the second group, or he could wait until he knew that it was safe. So Avram decided to wait. And after all his group got to safety, he spent 14 months living in the forest with the Russian partisans. And he spent his days blowing up Nazi trains and scalping Nazis to survive. And he even told me that he had to drink his own urine to survive when there was no food. Masha was from Sosnowiec in Poland. And due to the rise of anti-Semitism, Masha's family decided to escape and leave Poland. And they spent the years of the war in the former Soviet Union, living in Kazakhstan and Siberia. And fortunately, her immediate family all survived the war together. Masha and Avram met at university in Lodz after the war. Masha was studying to be a doctor and Avram to be a Yiddish teacher. They fell in love, and eventually they realized that their dream of continuing to live in Poland was not a safe option. So due to the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of communism, and because of the Communist Party's treatment of Bund members, and knowing what happened to Avram's father, Yankel, they decided to move to France. And they lived there for a few years, and they loved going specifically to a cafe called Scheherazade, where they would drink lots of champagne and have a fabulous time. And Scheherazade was a Middle Eastern princess or queen who became very famous for sharing and telling stories. And she told stories for 1,100 nights. So in Paris, Avram and Masha had a son, their oldest child named John, who was my father. And they decided that they wanted to find their forever home. So they decided to move to Australia. There was some controversy over this because Avram wanted to go to Israel to fight for its independence. But I think Masha and her family wanted to have a bit more of a quieter life. And like many other survivors, they decided to come to the other side of the world where there's not as much conflict. And so they came all the way to this distant remote place called Australia. When they came to Australia, they bought, with the assistance of Jewish welfare at the time, they bought a milk bar and they turned it into an Eastern European restaurant. And they named it after the cafe that they went to in France, in Paris, called Cafe Scheherazade. And this place, it became a safe haven for survivors. It was open for over 50 years. And on Sunday mornings, there would be huge lines out the door. Everyone wanted to come in, and they served Eastern European food so that people who came from these places could go, and it would remind them of their home. And actually, if you have a look at the images, you can see that there's a plaque that reads, that is still there today. So if you go to Ackland Street and you go, I think it's now Cotton on Body. And if you go to this shop, you can see a plaque that says, established in 1958, Scheherazade became an important gathering place for the local community. As a cafe serving traditional Eastern European fare, it was a haven for many refugees. It also attracted writers and artists who would work for hours from that corner of the cafe. And like I said, it drew a lot of attention. The Zeleznikovs retired in 1999, but Cafe Scheherazade lives still in theatre and plays. So here on the image in the left, there was an author called Arnold Zabel that was so inspired by the restaurant story that he actually wrote a book about the restaurant. And underneath that picture, you can see this is the author of the book, Arnold Zabel, with Avram and Masha. And on the right, these are two pictures of a play by Therese Radic that was put on where there were actors playing my grandparents and also different people and different characters that would come to the restaurant. A really unique experience that happened when my grandfather passed away in 2013. The man who played my Zeta, my grandfather in the play, came to the funeral, and he was actually leaning on the stone or on the area where his body was being rested. And I remember my mum saying how special and unique it is that this man was standing right next to it, and it kind of felt like he was living on in some ways. So as I mentioned, why these people are so incredibly important to me is because they were my grandparents. So this is a picture on the left of me and my Buba Masha at my year 12 graduation. The photo on the right, I was a bit younger. This is a photo of me and my older sister and my Zeta. And they had a profound impact on me growing up. Their incredible resilience to keep going and to create a special place for survivors to share their stories will always stay with me. And on a personal note, I can honestly not remember a time when my grandparents did not discuss the Holocaust with me. My Zeta was unique because his life he was so incredibly proud to speak about his experiences always from the beginning, which is very different to other survivors because he saw himself as a fighter in the forest. And I guess he kept his humanity. He would tell any person that was willing to hear about his experiences. Those 14 months living in the forest really shaped who he was. And in fact, my father wrote an article all about partisan on the other side of the world, and all of, I guess, his experiences living in Australia was relatively anticlimactic after what he experienced in the forest. It was almost the peak of his life because it shaped him dramatically. So with all this in mind, I very much was interested always in the Holocaust throughout school. When I got the opportunity to, I would write papers on it. And like Alex said, I decided to do a Bachelor's of Social Work at RMIT University. And I did my honors thesis on intergenerational Holocaust trauma. So I was able to analyze the testimonies of children and grandchildren of survivors that came to Australia. So outside of America and Israel per capita, Melbourne had the most survivors come in the world. Over 8,000 survivors came, which is a very high number. So I analyzed videos from the Jewish Holocaust Center in Melbourne of second and third generation to see what the trends were in trauma and what social workers can do to deal with this trauma and to support the second and third generation. During my degree, I also was very lucky to be given a placement at Jewish Care Victoria, where I eventually was hired. So I worked as a social worker and an activities facilitator. And again, as Alex mentioned, one of the most influential parts of my professional life was creating and designing a group called Remembering the Past, where it was for elders that were still living in the community. So they had to be over 65, and majority of the clients that came were Holocaust survivors. And they came and they shared their life stories, and we wrote them in books. So they worked one-on-one with volunteers to write about their pre-war life, their family history, all the way up until today. And we had a presentation evening where the clients and their families were presented with these books. And it was absolutely incredible to see the resilience of these people, just like my grandparents, after going through such atrocities and then being able to move to Australia, to build families, to rebuild their lives. I found them incredibly inspirational. But I realized, as much as I love my role working with survivors, that it was a job that I couldn't do forever. And I was very, very passionate about Holocaust education and Holocaust research. And I knew that in Australia, there was no specific degree dedicated to the Holocaust that I could do. So I actually found out about the program I'm studying now just on the internet. And I applied 2 years ago, and I got accepted to the MA, the Weiss Livnat MA in Holocaust Studies at Haifa University. But because of COVID, I decided to defer for the year. But in the end, I came in October last year, and I'm having the most incredible time. It is unbelievable. I am so blessed with this opportunity. It's a very special master's program because it's interdisciplinary, which means that I'm doing subjects about history, but I'm also doing subjects about art and psychology and museum curation and education and others. So I can use my experience as a social worker and do classes like psychology and anthropology. And it's just so specific to my interests. And that's what's fantastic about this program. I'm also, as Alex mentioned, doing an internship at the Ghetto Fighters House, Lochamei HaGhettoot. So it's the oldest Holocaust museum in Israel. And it's unique because it was set up by Holocaust survivors who survived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and they created this museum and this kibbutz itself. So myself and one of my classmates are learning how to guide in English, which is a great opportunity. I also wanted to take a moment to share the incredible network of people that I'm studying with. I could not do this program without them. A lot of them are actually on the Zoom today watching me and supporting me. I'm getting very emotional because I'm very lucky. So I've got friends from Denmark, Kosovo, Luxembourg, Greece, the US, Israel, and so many other places. You can see images of them in the PowerPoint slide in front of you. And as much as I love Melbourne and I love Australia and I love my friends, it's so special to come here and be with people who share such an interest in the Holocaust and sharing stories and wanting to educate others so that we never forget. And I'm very lucky to do this program. So if anyone has any questions later on and wants to discuss the program with me at a later stage, I'd be happy to talk about it. One class that I took last semester was called Final Solution. And this was a history course, and it was all about the Nazis' plan to exterminate the Jewish people. And for this class, I wrote a research paper on something called the Wittenberg Affair. It's a series of events that took place in the Vilna Ghetto. And the reason that I've also told you so much about my family story is because this topic is very important to me, because it was set in the Vilna Ghetto, who my grandfather knew all the people I'm going to be discussing. And this, not only is it history, but it's his lived story. So I want to express that the motivation for me to do this topic is very driven also by my family. So I'm going to start off now talking a little bit about the history of Vilna. So Vilna, or also known as Vilnius or Vilno, currently is in southeastern Lithuania. However, the map that I'm showing you today is actually from Poland in 1933. It is important to keep in mind that this was between the two world wars. Between World War I and World War II, this is the map of Poland, and you can clearly see up in the top that Vilna is in Poland. Some other differences today is Lvov is now in Ukraine. Danzig, now Gdansk is in Poland, which has changed. Vilna, now Vilnius is now in Lithuania. And basically Poland has moved about 50 kilometers west between the wars. Vilna, so it became an important center of Jewish culture, politics, and intellectual activity. And it was renowned throughout the Jewish world as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Before the war, Vilna had approximately, the Second World War, Vilna had approximately more than 100,000 Jewish people. After World War I, both Poland and Lithuania claimed Vilna. They both wanted Vilna to be in their countries. But the Polish forces in Vilna in 1920, before the outbreak of World War II, occupied Vilna, and it was part of the northeast of Poland. On August 23rd, 1939, there was a pivotal shift in Vilna's history when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact the Soviet-Nazi non-aggression treaty was enacted. The non-aggression treaty meant that Germany and the Soviet Union secretly planned to divide the area between themselves. Vilna was returned to Lithuania by the Soviets in the fall of 1939, and then Lithuania, including Vilna, was annexed by the USSR in the summer of 1940. The Germans besieged the Soviet Union in an operation called Barbarossa. So within 2 days, on the 24th of June 1941, Vilna was under the control of the Nazis. So I've given you a lot of history. Basically, Vilna was a very disputed area. First, it was Poland, then it was Lithuania, it was occupied by the Soviets, then it was occupied by the Nazis. So there were a lot of changes in a very short amount of time. After the Germans occupied Vilna in 1941, they almost instantly started to carry out the Führer, the leader, Hitler's orders, which was sanctioned, which meant that the Führer wanted all of the Soviet Union to be totally annihilated of all the Jews, the Gypsies, the racially inferior, and other asocial elements. So what's unique about Vilna than other parts of Poland is that very quickly they had the Einsatzgruppen come. These are the mobile killing squads that would come and already start to round up Jewish people and take them to nearby forests and areas, make them dig their own pits and graves, and killed them. So approximately in early September 1941, already 25,000 Jews from Vilna had been murdered at Ponary, which is what happened to my grandfather's family. They were taken to Ponary forest close to Vilnius. So now we're going to speak a little bit about the ghetto. So the ghetto was established, and Jewish inhabitants of Vilna were only given 1 day to move to the ghetto. There were 2 different ghettos located in the city center. A ghetto is basically an enclosed space that Jewish people were forced to move into. Usually the not nice areas of the town, they were sent there. Sometimes they were fenced in, other times not. In the Vilna Ghetto, I believe they were. So there were 2 ghettos located in the city center. The large one housed the workers, and the second smaller one housed the aging population. And by moving all the Jewish people to be in one area, it was a lot easier for the Germans to then do with them what they want for labor, or ultimately to kill them for death. And what was so unique as well about Vilna is while the Jewish community was incarcerated in the ghetto walls, they were able to express spiritual resistance through different cultural activity. So I mentioned that Vilna was seen as the Jerusalem of Lithuania because they had so much culture. They continued to perform theater. They created a newspaper called Ghetto Yedis, and it was all distributed under the guidance of the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, which I'll speak a little bit about later on. Another fact worth mentioning is that in 1984, an Israeli playwright called Joshua Sobel created a play about the ghetto and about all the experiences of the Jews in Vilna. And the play focused on the theater and incorporated music, and they included historical figures like the head of the Jewish police and later the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, a man named Jacob Gans, who again, I'm about to speak about in more detail, but just showing that later on, it was very much acknowledged the unique cultural expression that was still kept alive in the ghetto during this dark period. So now that I've spoken a little bit about the history of Vilna, we're now going to get to the main topic of my paper. Afterwards, if anyone's interested in reading my paper as well, I'm happy to send out the paper for people to read. So the Wittenberg Affair. We have 3 images here of 3 different people that I'm now going to talk about because they're very key people in the story of the events that are about to unfold. I should also warn you that the specifics of these events slightly differ depending on sources. So this explanation hopes to give a comprehensive overview, but depending on different books you read, there is a lot of disparity between what happened. So this could be due to a lot of reasons, but basically this is the case. So please know that if you already know the story and you think that what I'm saying is incorrect, you could also be completely right. So there was a group of young adults from different youth organizations that were incarcerated in the ghetto that decided on the 21st of January, 1943, so this was a couple years after Vilna was already occupied. So in the ghetto, in the beginning of 1943, they decided that they couldn't take it anymore, what was going on to them in the ghetto, that they were being taken to be killed. They were aware what was happening, which is different to other places in Europe. They were aware that families were being sent away and they weren't coming back. They were sent to the forest and they weren't seeing them again. So this group in January 43 decided that they were going to create a group about resistance and revenge, and that they wanted to survive and they didn't want to just go like lambs to the slaughter, is the quote. So this organization was called, please excuse my pronunciation, the Fahrenheit Partisana Organization, the FPO, I'll refer to, the United Partisan Organization. So the man pictured in the center, this man over here, his name was Yitzhak Wittenberg. And it was decided that he was going to be the head of the FPO, the resistance movement. He was a little bit older than the others, and he was also very involved in the Communist Party and had connections with non-Jewish Communist Party members outside of the ghetto. So the other members of the underground thought that he would be an appropriate member to be the head of the organization. The next person in the top right, his name is Abakovna, and he is probably more well known. From my knowledge, people know more about Abakovna than they do about Yitzhak Wittenberg. That could be to the fact that after the war, he immigrated to Israel. He was very involved in the establishment of the state of Israel. He testified at the Eichmann trial, and he is a very well-known Holocaust survivor. But Abakovna was in the Vilna Ghetto, and he was a part of the youth movement Hashomer Hatzair, Hashi, which is in Melbourne, a Zionist youth movement, and another man called Joseph Glazeman was the second in command. So we've got Yitzhak Wittenberg was the head of the underground organization, Abakovna was the second in command. And the man at the bottom right, who I've mentioned already, his name was Jacob Gans. And Jacob Gans was the head of the Jewish police and the ghetto administration of the Vilna in 1943, in July, when the Wittenberg Affair took place. And the ghetto was created in 41, so a few years earlier. The Judenrat, Jewish Council, was established, and it was an internal Jewish rule, also known as the Jewish Council. And Gans, as I said, was also the head of the police. And the relationship between the Jewish police and the Judenrat and the relationship with the underground was very ambiguous. And that relationship is very interesting than compared to other ghettos, because Jacob Gans at times was very supportive of the underground and even sourced funds and armament and materials to the underground. So if people have watched movies about the Warsaw Ghetto and thought that there's this idea that the Judenrat were only in it for themselves, they just wanted to survive, they didn't care what happened to the Jewish people, it can be argued that Jacob Gans was not like this. He did collaborate with the underground for a time, but there was a big shift in this relationship, which is the main topic of this project, is that their relationship changed due to the Wittenberg Affair. So what happened was that on the 9th of July, 1943, two members, not Jewish, of the Communist Party, they were living outside of the ghetto, they were caught by the Gestapo. Being a communist was unacceptable. It was very anti-German. When we talked about asocial people, political prisoners, these were communists. The communists were very much on the hit list of the Germans. So these two non-Jewish communists were found by the Germans, by the Gestapo, and they were interrogated. They wanted to find out names of other people that they were working with. And one of the men gave up the name of Wittenberg. So none of the other members of the underground names were given up, only his, because he was a communist, whereas the other Jewish people had different ideologies in the underground. So Wittenberg's name was given up by a man called Kozlovsky. And as a direct result of this newfound information, Jacob Gans, the head of the Judenrat, was instructed to give up Wittenberg to Bruno Kittel for questioning. And Bruno Kittel was the commander of the Nazi security office in Vilna. He was the top dog. So it was believed that Wittenberg was captured by the Nazis. They found him maybe on the streets. He was taken away and arrested very quickly. But actually, members of the FPO, the underground, broke him out of being in jail, and he went into hiding for a week. And this week caused complete chaos in the ghetto. During this time, in the ghetto, the tensions were very, very high. And the Vilna Gestapo demanded the extradition of the FPO leader, Yitzhak Wittenberg. They wanted him alive, or they would destroy the whole ghetto. So they gave an ultimatum to Jacob Gans, and the slogan was 1 or 20,000. Either you give him up, or we're going to liquidate the entire ghetto. So either you give us, and this is one of the points of contention. We don't know in the beginning if they even knew that he was Jewish. So obviously he was in the Vilna Ghetto, they knew he was Jewish. But when his name was given, it was only as a communist. He wasn't even known for being the head of the underground. But in the end, they captured him, he escaped, and now he's living in hiding. And the real question is, what was the Judenrat going to do? What was the council going to do? Were they going to surrender Wittenberg, or were they going to fight? If they said, no, we don't want to give you Wittenberg, there would be some sort of uprising. If you don't follow the orders of the Germans, there's going to be absolute chaos. So on the 15th of July, 1943, Gans decided, this is about a week after what happened with the two communists. On the 15th of July, 1943, Gans decided to invite Wittenberg to a meeting. And Wittenberg believed that Gans had no intention of giving him up because they've had quite a relatively harmonious relationship up until this point. So he decided to go to this meeting at his home, and he decided that he would take some of his comrades with him, and Abba Kovner was present at this meeting in Jacob Gans's home. And they were tasked with this unfathomable decision. Do they give up the leader and the commander, or do they confront their oppressors head on, likely to start an uprising? As a collective, the leaders of the underground FPO concluded that the ghetto residents still had some hope for survival. However, they did not want something to speed up this liquidation of the ghetto. They didn't want to have an uprising because that would cause the masses to be killed faster. So they decided as a collective that Yitzhak Wittenberg should be surrendered to the Germans. And because his peers, another controversial point is how much he was pressured into doing it, or whether it was under his own volition that he decided to do this. This is a contested topic, but in the end, he said, if it's your wish, I shall go. And then he left, and he was taken with the wishes of his comrades, and he turned himself into the Gestapo. After Wittenberg surrendered himself, most sources confirmed that he was dead the next day. However, there are some variations on how he died. One source suggests that he gave himself up and that he was murdered by the Gestapo, but another one says that he took his own life and that Jacob Gans actually gave him a cyanide pill so that he could take his own life. But that in itself was an act of defiance, to say to the Germans, I get to decide when I die, you don't get to. He knew that ultimately it was going to happen. And he also would have done this so that he wouldn't have been tortured to give up other people's names, so that if he took his own life quickly, he wouldn't have been tortured. So I gave you a bit of an explanation or overview of the Wittenberg Affair. Now what I want to talk about is some of the different perspectives and attitudes of the Wittenberg Affair and the influences. So the different groups that I'm going to be looking at is the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, the Jewish police, which is different, the ghetto residents, just the general public that lived in the ghetto, and the thoughts and feelings of the underground, of the FPO. The Judenrat. So ultimately, Jacob Gans decided that the best decision at the point in time was for the ghetto to surrender Wittenberg. Bruno Kittel threatened to destroy the ghetto, and if Gans did not give him up, basically the ghetto administration was being blackmailed into handing over Wittenberg. If Gans failed to present him, then the lives of the residents of the ghetto were being put into jeopardy. The Jewish leadership in the ghetto was faced with an agonizing dilemma: either cooperate with the Germans or defy them. And the real dilemma, of course, is the possible consequences of the leadership's actions. The Jewish police. So the Jewish police commanded, the Judenrat commanded and organized the Jewish police in the ghetto, and they were in charge of the crime. And these organizations were organized by the Germans. And so it's important for us to understand the complexities that they were being influenced by the Germans, but then were Jewish themselves and worked with the Jewish people. So the Jewish police's relationship with the underground and with the Wittenberg Affair is also very complex. When Wittenberg surrendered to be taken away to jail and ultimately he was killed, it was members of the Jewish police who had come to Jacob Gans's house, who had brought Wittenberg to the Gestapo. So that it was the members of the police that helped turn him in, and they very much were working with the Germans. But in comparison to this, it was also members of the Jewish police when he was earlier interned that told the underground that he was in jail and helped him escape for that week. So there were members of the police that were really, really collaborating with the Germans, and there were members of the police that were trying to help him come out. And another factor is that there were members of the Jewish police that very much aided the underground, and they joined the partisan group, and they escaped to the forest with them. So it's very interesting to analyze the role that they had, because nothing in the story is black and white, the good guys versus the bad guys. And that's what I'm going to discuss later about choiceless choices, is that people did what they did so they could survive. Now I'll speak a little bit about the perspective of the ghetto residents. The general population in the ghetto was also faced with a great challenge. They could support the hiding of Wittenberg, and by doing so, they would support the FPO, which many of their families were involved in. These were regular families, and it was their own children that they knew that were involved in the underground. So by defying and going against Wittenberg to save themselves, are they going against the underground? Yitzhak Arad, a famous Holocaust scholar, writes, the consensus in the ghetto was that a ghetto of 20,000 people, that's who was left, because a lot of the Jews had already been killed the forests or taken away. The consensus in the ghetto was that a ghetto of 20,000 people should not be imperiled for the sake of one man whose activity was connected with the communists outside the ghetto. So that was a very interesting quote from Arad explaining the opinion of the ghetto residents, that there was clearly a distinction between Jewish people and those that were involved with the communists. They were thinking, oh, here's a communist that's involved with communist ideologies. We need to save ourselves. So even within the ghetto, within the Jewish community, there was still, you know, a lot of anti-communist tropes involved. So panic overtook the ghetto, and the population, I'm talking generally, of course, I'm not talking on an individual basis. In general, the population demanded that Wittenberg be surrendered. There was no mistaking the tempo of the ghetto. It was Wittenberg or bloodshed. The common perspective held by the ghetto residents was to distance themselves from Wittenberg to secure the overall survival of the entire ghetto population. The viewpoint of the underground. The underground resistance movement was set up, as I've mentioned, as an armed fighting organization that seeked revenge, and they wanted to survive. And their goal earlier was to prepare the Jews of Vilna for an uprising if the Nazis were to liquidate the ghetto. What happened in Warsaw Ghetto? There was a very famous uprising there that happened earlier. And so because of they knew in Vilna that it wasn't super successful. Majority of the people died, or they managed to escape to safety by some miracle, but it really wasn't that successful. And I think they didn't have as much support by the ghetto residents for an uprising. There was still that idea of, if we are complacent, if we wait, maybe eventually the Soviets will come, the war will end, and we'll survive. They wanted to prolong this liquidation. They wanted to prolong, you know, obviously being killed, which was what they wanted to avoid. So an uprising didn't happen, and that's one of the reasons why they wanted to give up Wittenberg, so that they could remain not having such an uprising. And that's one of the reasons why they decided to give him up. Interestingly enough, in 1986, Abakovna wrote the following comment in response to a poem that he wrote. So this was 86, many, many years after the war. He wrote, on July 16th, 1943, the commander of the Vilna Ghetto underground, Yitzhak Wittenberg, acceded to the Gestapo the demands and surrendered himself to his killers to save the ghetto. I think that's quite interesting that in his own words, Abakovna said that Wittenberg surrendered himself. And when we think of Abakovna, we really think of him as an incredible, influential person. I'll explain later, they ended up going to the forest and he ended up surviving and has an incredible story. But it's interesting the terminology that he used, that it was Wittenberg who gave himself up. Different sources say different things, whether he was pressured into doing so. So here we have a couple of images of some different groups. So the bottom picture is a group portrait of members of the Vilna Ghetto Jewish police. They've got their armbands on, and I think this photo was taken in the ghetto itself. The top left picture is a photo of Vilna after the liberation. So this was not until 1944. These are Jewish partisans who were members of the FPO, and they left the ghetto and they fought in the forest and they survived. So the people in the top left photo, this is a picture after the Nazi occupation ended in 1944. I've missed a picture. Sorry, the top right picture. The top right picture is a photo in the ghetto in the 1940s, and those are members of the underground in the ghetto. And this here, if you can see my clicker, this is Aberkovna here. And that's a picture of them in the, in the ghetto itself. Aftermath. So what happened in the direct aftermath of the Wittenberg Affair? Aberkovna and the underground, the FPO, after the demise of Wittenberg, Kovna stepped up and became the commander. He was now the head of the underground. Again, this is why he's so well known, because he was the head of the resistance movement and he survived, which is one of the reasons why he's so well known. I'll be honest, before I did this project, I knew almost nothing about Wittenberg. It was my father who told me that I should research him, and I'm very glad that he did. So he became the commander of the FPO, and in the aftermath, they decided to move their activities into the forest, and they planned their evacuation. And very soon after the Wittenberg Affair, still in July 25th of 1943, that is when they started to flee to the forest. And that was headed by Joseph Glaseman. He was the other deputy of Wittenberg, and he was killed very soon after. When he went into the forest, he was killed. I believe my grandfather Avram went in September, from what I read. He was very young at the time. He was 17, but he was very much involved as well. He knew Aberkovna very well. He went with him to the forest. He knew Wittenberg, he knew Jacob Gans, and he joined the FPO and went to the forest as well. What happened to the Jewish people that was left in the ghetto? Not everyone fled to the forest. We're talking about a minority of young, fit, active people, probably more men than women, I believe. So only 1 month, I think a couple of thousand ended up, which is a big number of people to live in the forest. But in the scheme of the numbers of Jewish people in Vilna, it was a very small minority. So only 1 month after the Wittenberg Affair, in August, the Germans began to liquidate the ghetto. They liquidated the ghetto. And that's my biggest theme when I talk about choiceless choices. What I'll get to is Wittenberg was surrendered, but in the end, the ghetto was liquidated anyway, because that was the plan of the Germans. Even though they gave this ultimatum of 1 or 20,000, really the outcome would have still been the same. And it was the same, because the ghetto was liquidated. On the 14th of September, Jacob Gans was shot by the Gestapo 10 days before the ghetto was completely liquidated. Of the remaining residents of the ghetto, approximately 10,000 were transported to camps in Estonia and Latvia. The conditions there were terrible. Many, many people died. And an additional 4,000 women, children, and elderly were sent to the Sobibor death camp, where they were murdered. And a small number of Jews remained in Vilna as forced laborers. So now I get to this theme of choiceless choice. Here we have an image of the movie Sophie's Choice, a very well-known choiceless choice. I don't believe the story is actually true, but it's about a woman, a non-Jewish woman, a Polish woman, very famous movie with Meryl Streep. She was sent to a concentration camp or a death camp, Auschwitz most likely, with her 2 children. And one German said, "You can pick between your son and your daughter who will be sent to the gas chamber and who will survive." And this is this concept of choice. The Germans appealing to give a choice to people when ultimately it wasn't a choice. Choiceless choice is a term that was coined by Lawrence Langer to describe the no-win situations faced by Jews during the Holocaust. The concept means that all choices were essentially false, as all Jews were to be annihilated. The term "the final solution," created by Nazi Germany, meant that their goal was to exterminate the Jews. So whether you were a part of the Judenrat or Jewish police and you had these roles that other Jews looked down on, you're doing this just to survive, Well, ultimately, it was the goal of the Germans to annihilate anyone that was Jewish. So everyone was kind of still in the same group. And if they had roles, it was so that they could assist the Germans in what they were planning. It wasn't really just to save themselves. So often scholars want to claim that people should have left earlier. They should have fought back. They should have hidden. They had all these choices. They should have ran away. But the truth is that no one could have imagined the horrors of the Holocaust. People did not know exactly what was happening on a day-to-day level. And we, as people today in 2022, cannot sit here and judge people for the choices that they made. We are not in that situation, and Baruch Hashem, we never will be. And basically, people did what they thought would be right. And the truth is that many of the obvious choices would have led to death. I want to stay and protect my family. I want to look after my parents. My grandfather had guilt for the rest of his life for leaving his mother and family in the ghetto. But if he wouldn't have done that, he wouldn't have survived. So the most obvious choice of looking after your family, that could have meant death. Today, we need to recognize that their choices were limited, frequently with no viable options, and Holocaust victims agonized over their choices. The Wittenberg Affair is a choiceless choice. The literature demonstrated that the affair was less about individual stakeholders and more about how the largest number of people can survive. The methods might differ, such as collaborating with the Germans or choosing to flee to the forest, but ultimately the choices were made, and the surrender of Wittenberg was done to keep the residents of the ghetto safe. Ultimately, the fate of the Jewish people, I've already mentioned this, but ultimately the fate of the Jewish people was already sealed, regardless of the outcome of the Wittenberg Affair. And it was inevitable that the ghetto was going to be liquidated, just like Warsaw, just like Lodz, just like many other ghettos. I also wanted to point out that in Lithuania, 96% of the Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, which is one of the highest in Europe, which is devastating. And even though they tried to collaborate with the Germans and give up Wittenberg, ultimately it was very, very high death rates, and it was a big tragedy. So that's the end of the official presentation. I wanted to thank you all for listening, and I'm welcome to have any questions.
Eva, thank you so much. That was truly fascinating. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matana. I'm the administrator for March of the Living, March of the Living Australia. As Alex pointed out at the beginning of the evening, the presentation was meant to be moderated by Cedric Geffen, who is the president for March of the Living Australia. And unfortunately, due to very unforeseen last-minute circumstances, he was unable to join us. He was hoping to join partway through, but he could not make it. So I will proceed with this next section. I'm wary, and I know we've kept you quite long, and Eva, thank you so much for that presentation. It was truly fascinating. I think in and of itself, the topic is amazing, but I think given the context of your family and your background that you provided, I think that's it was heightened all the more. So thank you for that. I may get you, Eva, actually just to stop sharing your screen. That way we can see you fully there. But I'm sure if you are
sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I'm sure if you are happy to share those resources, that bibliography. And you mentioned also your paper that you would be happy to share with people. I'm sure they would be very fascinated to read that. So thank you. If you pass that on to us, I'll be happy to forward that to anyone who would like it. For this next little section for a Q&A, if anyone does have any questions for Eva, please do put them through in the chat, and I will raise them here. We've just had one come through actually from Miriam Sterling, who has asked, is there much documentation of the lives of those who were put into these unenviable positions of Jewish police, and particularly the kapos?
So I think that's a great question. Thanks, Miriam. The research paper that I did was not so much focused on primary research. It was more of a smaller paper. But if I did more extensive research, I know that there's quite a few diaries that people kept in the Vilna Ghetto. And I did look at one by a name called Crook. And there are certainly a lot of primary documents that that more research could be done into. Absolutely.
Great. We've had a not so much a question, more of a comment from John, who you may know, Eva, who has mentioned that perhaps you may want to mention or talk about Rumkowski and Lodge, who had great collaboration with the Nazis. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that you may be open to sharing.
Yes, I know John wanted me to talk about this in my presentation. It wasn't a focus of my paper, so I decided not to, but I have discussed this with John. The head of the Jewish Council, the Judenrat in the Lodz ghetto, Rumkowski, collaborated or worked with quite a lot more with the Germans. And actually, in the Lodz ghetto, it was liquidated much later, I believe 1944, because it was used also for forced labor, and the Germans were finding that using the Jewish people in the ghetto as slave workers, it made more sense to keep them around longer. So the ghetto was liquidated much later, but that meant actually more people survived because they would have gone to concentration camps for only a much shorter amount of time, a few months, because it was 44, whereas people that were sent a few years earlier would have had much less likelihood of surviving. But so there were actually more cases of people surviving than in the Vilna Ghetto.
Amazing. And we've got another question here from Lisa Storer. Thank you, Lisa. Who says, it was an excellent presentation, Eva, thank you. And she's wondering, how has studying in Israel affected your access to archival resources?
That is a fantastic question, Lisa. Lisa actually studies with me. She's from the US. And as a side note, her research a lot is to do with the Kovno ghetto, also in Lithuania, and she's doing research on the Judenrat, the Jewish Council in Kovno. So that would also be an interesting comparison to look at what happened in Kovno compared to Vilna. During this program, it's been incredible. We had a 5-day seminar at Yad Vashem where they took us to different archives of art, work, and of objects, and they have an entire space dedicated to researching survivors and also victims, researching testimonies. And also, because I've been working at the Ghetto Fighters House, they have an unbelievable resource as well there. It is accessible online. So if you look up, for example, the Ghetto Fighters House, and if you want to look up someone or a place, you can find it. But when you go into the museum, they have an unedited vast amount more resources there, because some families or some people don't want to have it out in the wide web, but there is a lot. I mean, that's one of the best things about coming to study here. Whilst Melbourne has a Holocaust Center and they do have artifacts, there is just a huge amount here from all over Europe and also North Africa.
Amazing. We've got one more question that's just come through, and I apologize for my pronunciation if this is incorrect, so please forgive me, from Leke Rezniki, who says that he remembers you mentioning that there is not a lot of research on this topic. I presume he means Wittenberg. Would you, or perhaps something else, Leke, please feel free to clarify. He asks though, would you consider doing that yourself? So expanding on the research on this topic.
I was extremely surprised when I was doing research that I couldn't even find, maybe if somebody else wants to do research and find it for me, I couldn't even find an biography about Wittenberg. There was very, very little information. I could find bits of chapters from different books. A very well-known book by Dina Porat was written about Abba Kovner. There's a lot of work about Abba Kovner, and there's really not so much about Wittenberg. Would I consider doing it myself? I'd love to. Why not? Thanks. If anyone wants to get me to do a PhD about it, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Great. And I think that's the last question we received, but perhaps I'll close off with one from one of my own. It's been really fascinating hearing, all about your background and obviously the incredible legacy and impact that your grandparents had in the community over here. In that sense, viewing it from that light, it kind of seems inevitable that you've gone on to do what you have done and what you are doing. But you've approached it from a really interesting path of your social work and everything that you've done before. I was curious to know if working in the Holocaust space and research, if that was something that you kind of knew you would be eager to do, early on, perhaps in high school, or if that's something that kind of appealed to you a little later. For those, I should probably mention that Eva and I do know one another, although we haven't seen each other in quite some time. Eva was a number of years below me at high school. So I was curious to know, I suppose, if you had this kind of churning in the back of your head already back then, or if it's something that you've kind of arrived at over the last few years.
Thank you. It was a great question. I wanted to do this since the moment I could remember. I remember being in my parent-teacher interviews in year 11, and my parents who are here today can attest to it. My English teacher said, Eva, there's other topics you can write about besides the Holocaust. So clearly I've proven her wrong, that I am able to continue writing about the Holocaust. I'm very blessed that in my social work degree, even though it's not focused on Holocaust trauma, I was able to still write about it. In my honors thesis, I was able to find a job working with survivors in Melbourne, and now doing this program, it's been an incredible opportunity. And I really didn't think that I could make a career out of working in the field of Holocaust, and I'm very, very lucky.
Well, if I may say so, I could tell that there was something that you've been wanting to pursue for some time, because of the passion with which you delivered your presentation, it was really very palpable, and I'm sure we all really benefited from your presentation this afternoon for you. So thank you so much for your time. On behalf of everyone who have joined us and everyone who will view this recording, we thank you, and we very much look forward to hearing how your studies progress. We wish you all the best with your studies and to the rest of your cohort, and very much look forward to seeing the results of your studies. So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we will wrap that up this evening. Thank you for your fantastic questions, and thank you for joining us. Just a note for those who haven't subscribed to our newsletter, we welcome you and invite you to do so, particularly in the coming month with Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron coming up, Yom HaAtzmaut. We will be publishing and publicizing a host of various events within the communities, both locally here in Australia and internationally through March of the Living. So do subscribe to our newsletter via our website, And you can follow us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram as well, to keep updated with all of those. And lastly, to say that for those who are observing the upcoming Chag of Pesach, we wish you a Chag Pesach Sameach. And thank you everyone for joining us, and wishing you a good night and a good day wherever you may be in the world. So thank you very much.